In the depths of Riverside High's forgotten basement, chains rattled against cold metal as a young teacher tested the limits of her restraints. What Connor Blake didn't know was that those hands he'd bound had once trained for Olympic glory. One precise judo throw was about to turn his reign of terror into a nightmare he'd never forget. This isn't just about bullying. This is about what happens when predators pick the wrong prey. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog clung to Millfield like a shroud, wrapping around the weathered brick walls of Riverside High School, where generations of working-class kids had trudged through their teenage years. This Pennsylvania town had seen better days, with shuttered factories dotting the landscape and hope feeling as scarce as decent jobs. Inside the school's cramped hallways, the social order was as rigid as the cast-iron radiators that clanked and hissed through another heating season. Connor Blake owned these halls with the swagger of someone who'd never faced real consequences. At 17, he stood 6'2" with the build of a wrestler who spent more time intimidating freshmen than actually training. His letterman jacket hung loose on broad shoulders, and his cold blue eyes scanned the corridors like a predator surveying his territory. Students instinctively stepped aside when he approached, their conversations dying mid-sentence as his presence sucked the warmth from any room. His inner circle moved with him like shadows. Ashley Reed clutched her phone like a weapon, her perfectly straightened blonde hair framing a face that could shift from sweet to savage in seconds. She documented everything for her social media empire, turning other people's humiliation into her personal content goldmine. Mason Torres flanked Connor's other side, a linebacker whose loyalty was bought with the promise of reflected popularity. His nervous laugh echoed through hallways whenever Connor's cruelty reached new heights, a soundtrack to suffering that had become Riverside's twisted normal. Their latest target sat hunched over a sketchbook in the far corner of the cafeteria, trying to disappear into the peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights. Emma Chen had learned to make herself invisible, her slight frame folded into oversized sweaters that couldn't quite hide the fear in her dark eyes. Her art was her escape, intricate drawings that transformed the ugly reality of Riverside into something beautiful. But beauty had no place in Connor's world, and her quiet creativity made her an irresistible target for someone who thrived on breaking things that couldn't fight back. The attack came during lunch period when the cafeteria monitor had stepped away to break up a food fight on the other side of the room. Connor's shadow fell across Emma's table like a storm cloud, and her pencil froze mid-stroke as she sensed the danger without looking up. With theatrical precision, he snatched her sketchbook and held it high above his head, just out of reach of her desperate grasps. The pages fluttered open, revealing months of careful work, each drawing a piece of her soul laid bare for his amusement. Ashley's phone was already recording, capturing every angle of Emma's humiliation as tears began streaming down her cheeks. The other students formed a loose circle, some pulling out their own phones while others looked away in shame, complicit in their silence. Connor's voice boomed across the cafeteria as he critiqued each drawing with cruel precision, his words designed to cut deeper than any physical blow. When Emma finally worked up the courage to reach for her book, he tossed it casually toward the trash can, pages scattering like broken dreams across the sticky linoleum floor. That's when the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Jessica Martinez stood in the cafeteria doorway, her athletic frame silhouetted against the harsh hallway lighting. She wasn't tall, maybe 5'6", but something in her posture commanded attention. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her brown eyes carried an intensity that made Connor's smirk falter for just a moment. She'd been at Riverside for exactly 3 weeks, hired as a substitute when the regular PE teacher went on medical leave, and already the rumors about her background had begun to swirl. Some students whispered she'd been a professional athlete before becoming a teacher. Others claimed they'd seen her car in the parking lot before dawn, heading to some mysterious training session. A few kids with access to Google had found old competition photos that might have been her, but the images were grainy and years old. What everyone agreed on was that she moved differently than other teachers, with the fluid grace of someone who understood their body as a weapon. The cafeteria fell silent as Jessica walked purposefully toward the scattered papers, her footsteps echoing against the linoleum. She knelt beside Emma's artwork, carefully gathering each page with the reverence of someone who understood the value of creation. Connor watched her with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up potential prey, his ego already bruised by the way conversations had stopped when she entered the room. He wasn't used to adults who didn't immediately defer to his father's influence in town. Principal Davis had made it crystal clear during Jessica's first week that certain students required delicate handling. Michael Blake's real estate empire controlled half the commercial properties in Millfield, and his monthly donations kept Riverside's athletics programs afloat. Cross his son, and you'd find yourself looking for work in another district. It was an unspoken rule that had protected Connor since middle school, creating a bubble of immunity that had only grown stronger with each passing year. But Jessica Martinez hadn't spent her 20s training at Olympic-level judo facilities to be intimidated by small-town politics. She'd walked away from competitive fighting after a career-ending shoulder injury, channeling her discipline into education instead of medals. Teaching was supposed to be her fresh start, a way to build something positive from the ashes of her athletic dreams. She'd taken the job at Riverside hoping for a quiet place to heal and find purpose beyond the mats where she'd once dominated opponents twice her size. As she handed Emma's rescued artwork back to the trembling sophomore, Jessica's eyes met Connor's with unwavering directness. The challenge was unspoken, but unmistakable, a line drawn in the sand that would reshape everything at Riverside High. Connor's reputation depended on never backing down, especially not in front of an audience with phones ready to capture any sign of weakness. He had no idea that the woman standing before him had spent years perfecting the art of using an opponent's aggression against them. The basement was calling, and Connor Blake was about to learn that some prey fight back. The weeks following Emma's public humiliation marked a subtle shift in Riverside High's ecosystem. Jessica Martinez had established herself as more than just another temporary teacher counting days until real employment elsewhere. Her morning routine began at 5:30 when she arrived at the empty school, using the outdated gymnasium to maintain the physical conditioning that had once defined her entire existence. Students occasionally glimpsed her through the frosted glass windows, moving through forms and exercises that seemed almost dance-like in their precision and control. Her classes quickly gained a reputation for being different. Where other PE instructors focused on traditional sports and fitness tests, Jessica introduced elements of self-defense and body awareness that most students had never encountered. She taught them how to fall safely, how to recognize their center of gravity, and, most importantly, how to project confidence even when they felt powerless. Emma Chen had become one of her most dedicated students, arriving early to practice the breathing techniques Jessica demonstrated for managing anxiety and fear. The gymnasium itself told the story of Riverside's declining resources. Paint peeled from the walls in long strips, and the hardwood floor bore scars from decades of sneakers and dropped equipment. The wrestling mats stacked in the corner hadn't been replaced in years, their surfaces cracked and patched with duct tape that spoke to the district's financial priorities. But Jessica transformed this space into something that felt almost sacred, a place where students could discover strengths they never knew they possessed. Connor Blake watched these developments with growing irritation. His domain had always extended beyond the hallways into every corner of school life, and Jessica's influence represented an unwelcome challenge to his authority. He'd noticed how students walked differently after spending time in her classes, how they made eye contact instead of looking away when he approached. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, like watching his kingdom erode one grain of sand at a time. Principal Davis had summoned Jessica to his office on a gray Thursday afternoon when October's chill had begun seeping through Riverside's old windows. His office reflected the same institutional decay as the rest of the building, with water stains blooming across acoustic ceiling tiles and a coffee maker that perpetually gurgled like it was drowning. Davis himself seemed worn down by years of managing a school with too little funding and too many problems, his shoulders permanently hunched as if bearing invisible weight. The conversation had been carefully scripted, full of diplomatic language that barely concealed its real message. The Blake family's contributions to the school district extended far beyond monetary donations, Davis explained while avoiding direct eye contact. Michael Blake sat on the school board and the town council, his influence reaching into every aspect of Millfield's civic life. Connor might be challenging at times, but he was essentially a good kid, who occasionally got carried away with typical teenage enthusiasm. Jessica had listened without interruption, her face revealing nothing as Davis painted a picture of a community where certain realities required acceptance rather than resistance. The wrestling team needed Connor's leadership, and his academic performance, while not stellar, was sufficient for graduation. Sometimes the greater good meant overlooking minor infractions in favor of maintaining stability and avoiding unnecessary conflicts that could damage everyone involved. The warning was clear even without explicit threats. Teachers who created problems for the Blake family found their contracts mysteriously non-renewable. Budget cuts had a way of eliminating positions held by staff members who failed to understand the delicate balance that kept Riverside functioning. Jessica's status as a substitute made her particularly vulnerable, a temporary employee who could disappear without explanation or consequence. But Jessica Martinez had faced pressure before, the kind that came from international competition where nations' pride hung in the balance. She'd thrown opponents who outweighed her by 50 pounds and submitted athletes who'd trained their entire lives for moments she'd stolen from them with superior technique and unshakable mental fortitude. A small-town bully and his politically connected father represented challenges she understood far better than they realized. The confrontation had been brewing since that day in the cafeteria, building pressure like steam in Riverside's ancient heating system. Connor's attempts to reassert dominance had grown increasingly desperate in public. He'd started timing his activities to coincide with Jessica's presence, ensuring she witnessed his treatment of students like Emma who'd begun showing signs of newfound confidence. The basement had always been Connor's private sanctuary, a place where he could operate without adult supervision or security cameras. The old detention room hadn't been officially used in years, but Connor had claimed it as his personal domain.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Where he conducted the kind of business that required privacy and isolation. The heavy door muffled sound, and the narrow staircase discouraged casual visitors who might stumble upon activities better left unwitnessed. Jessica had been heading to the parking lot after staying late to grade papers when she heard Emma's voice echoing from somewhere below ground level. The sound was muffled but unmistakably distressed, carrying the kind of panic that demanded immediate investigation. She'd followed the sound down the narrow staircase, her athletic shoes silent against concrete steps that seemed to descend into another world entirely. The basement stretched beneath Riverside like a forgotten catacomb, filled with discarded furniture and equipment that had been deemed too broken to use but too expensive to replace. Fluorescent tubes flickered overhead, casting irregular shadows that danced across water-stained walls and exposed pipes that carried the building's lifeblood through spaces most people never saw. Connor's voice carried clearly through the maze of storage rooms and abandoned offices, thick with the satisfaction of someone who believed themselves completely safe from consequences. Ashley's familiar giggle provided counterpoint to Emma's quiet sobs, while Mason's nervous energy manifested in the rhythmic bouncing of what sounded like a basketball against a concrete wall. Jessica moved through the basement with the fluid silence she'd perfected during years of competitive training, using shadows and architectural features to mask her approach. Her mind automatically cataloged potential weapons and escape routes, while assessing the tactical situation with the cold precision of someone who'd spent years studying how to neutralize threats efficiently and completely. The old detention room's door stood partially open, revealing a scene that ignited something primal in Jessica's carefully controlled psyche. Emma sat on the floor with her back against the massive cast-iron radiator that dominated one wall, her wrists secured with what appeared to be zip ties that Connor must have brought specifically for this purpose. Her sketchbook lay torn apart beside her, pages scattered like fallen leaves, while Connor stood over her with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never faced real resistance. Ashley crouched nearby with her phone extended, documenting Emma's humiliation for whatever sick purpose motivated her constant need to record other people's pain. Mason paced the small room like a caged animal, his nervous energy suggesting this had escalated beyond his comfort zone, but his loyalty to Connor preventing any intervention. The radiator itself was a relic from Riverside's original construction, a massive piece of cast iron that had been heating the building since the Eisenhower administration. Its surface was scarred with decades of scratches and dents, and the pipes connecting it to the main heating system were thick enough to anchor a ship. Connor had chosen his location well, creating a situation where Emma was physically secured to an immovable object in a room where her cries for help would never reach anyone who might care enough to respond. But Connor Blake had made a fatal miscalculation. He'd assumed that Jessica Martinez was just another teacher who would follow the unspoken rules that protected him from consequences. He had no way of knowing that the woman approaching through the basement shadows had spent years perfecting techniques specifically designed to neutralize larger, stronger opponents who believed their physical advantages made them invincible. The ancient Radiator was about to witness something it had never seen in all its decades of faithful service. And Connor Blake was about to discover that some chains bind both ways. Jessica's presence in the doorway went unnoticed for precious seconds as Connor reveled in his complete control over the situation. Emma's quiet whimpering provided a soundtrack to his monologue about respect and consequences. Words that revealed the twisted psychology of someone who'd never learned the difference between fear and genuine authority. Ashley continued her documentation with the detached focus of a nature photographer capturing predator behavior, while Mason's pacing had taken on an increasingly frantic quality that suggested his conscience was finally awakening to the reality of what they'd orchestrated. The detention room reeked of decades of teenage despair and institutional neglect, its concrete walls bearing the scratched initials and desperate messages of students who'd served time in this underground purgatory. Water damage had left permanent stains that resembled abstract art, and the single fluorescent fixture overhead buzzed with the irregular rhythm of electrical components long overdue for replacement. The massive radiator dominated the space like an iron altar, its surface warm to the touch as heated water circulated through pipes that connected every room in the building to this central nervous system of comfort and control. Emma's artistic hands, usually so steady and sure when creating beauty from blank pages, trembled against the plastic restraints that Connor had tightened with methodical precision. The zip ties bit into her wrists with increasing intensity as circulation decreased, each movement only serving to tighten the bonds that secured her to the radiator's immovable bulk. Her sketchbook lay in ruins around her, months of careful work transformed into confetti that scattered with every movement of air through the basement's ventilation system. Jessica stepped into the room with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent years learning to move without telegraphing intention. Her voice cut through Connor's rambling with the sharp clarity of someone accustomed to being heard above the chaos of competition. The simple command to release Emma immediately carried an authority that momentarily stunned the three tormentors into silence, their comfortable dynamics suddenly disrupted by an adult who clearly had no intention of following the established script. Connor's recovery was swift and revealing, his surprise quickly morphing into the predatory excitement of someone who'd found an even more satisfying target. The presence of a teacher in his private domain represented the ultimate challenge to his authority, an opportunity to demonstrate that his power extended beyond the harassment of fellow students into the realm of adult consequences. His smile took on a different quality as he gestured for Mason to position himself between Jessica and the door, effectively blocking her most obvious escape route. Ashley's phone swiveled to capture this new development, her social media instincts recognizing that whatever happened next would generate significantly more engagement than another routine bullying session. She positioned herself to film from multiple angles, her excitement barely contained as she anticipated content that would elevate her online presence to entirely new levels of notoriety and influence. The psychological warfare began with Connor's casual explanation of the evening's entertainment, his voice carrying the conversational tone of someone describing weekend plans rather than criminal activity. He detailed how Jessica's interference in school affairs had created problems that required correction, how certain teachers needed to learn their proper place in Riverside's carefully maintained hierarchy. The zip ties in his hand weren't just restraints, but symbols of his determination to establish dominance over anyone who dared challenge his authority. Jessica's response revealed nothing of the calculations running through her mind as she assessed distances, potential weapons, and the physical capabilities of her opponents. Years of competitive training had taught her to compartmentalize emotion during crisis situations, to transform anger and fear into fuel for precise action rather than allowing them to cloud judgment. She'd faced opponents who possessed every possible physical advantage, learning that technique and timing could overcome raw strength when applied with sufficient knowledge and unwavering commitment. Mason's attempt to grab her arms from behind was textbook amateur aggression, the kind of clumsy assault that experienced fighters learn to anticipate and exploit. His football training had emphasized collision and overwhelming force, approaches that worked well against opponents who fought back with similar tactics but proved useless against someone who understood leverage and momentum. Jessica's defensive movement seemed almost casual as she stepped aside, using his forward momentum to send him crashing into the concrete wall with enough force to leave him dazed and struggling to regain his orientation. Connor's charge came with the uncontrolled fury of someone who'd never encountered genuine resistance to his will. His wrestling background had given him confidence in his ability to overpower smaller opponents through superior strength and aggression, but his training had focused on controlled environments with rules and referees rather than real combat situations. Jessica met his attack with the kind of precision that transformed his forward momentum into a weapon against himself, her defensive techniques flowing together like movements in a carefully choreographed dance. The throw that sent Connor spinning through the air and crashing into a stack of broken desks was perfectly executed, a demonstration of classical judo principles that used his own aggressive energy to generate the force that left him gasping for breath among splintered wood and scattered papers. But Connor Blake had never learned when to quit, his bruised ego driving him to continue fighting even when tactical retreat would have been the wiser choice. Ashley's recording captured every moment of the confrontation, though she failed to recognize that she was documenting evidence that would ultimately destroy rather than enhance her social media empire. Her excitement at witnessing what she assumed would be Connor's domination of another victim blinded her to the reality that she was filming the systematic dismantling of everything that had made her feel powerful and untouchable. The second assault came when Connor produced the zip ties that had been intended for Emma's additional restraint, his plan shifting from simple intimidation to the complete subjugation of someone who dared to challenge his authority. Mason had recovered enough to provide clumsy assistance, their combined assault representing a level of escalation that crossed definitively into criminal territory rather than mere schoolyard bullying. Jessica's defensive training served her well as she evaded their initial attempts at restraint, but the confined space of the detention room limited her options for movement and escape. The concrete walls that had witnessed decades of teenage punishment now became tactical obstacles that restricted her ability to create distance from her attackers. Connor's determination to establish dominance had transformed rational thought into pure aggression, his usual calculated cruelty replaced by the desperate fury of someone whose entire identity depended on never losing control. The moment when the zip ties finally secured Jessica's wrists to the radiator represented Connor's greatest triumph and his ultimate downfall. In his excitement at having successfully restrained someone who'd embarrassed him, he failed to recognize that he'd simply altered the tactical situation rather than ending the conflict. The massive cast-iron radiator that seemed like the perfect anchor for his victory would soon become the foundation for his defeat. Ashley moved closer with her phone, eager to document what she assumed would be Jessica's humiliation and breakdown. Mason stood guard near the door, finally beginning to grasp the magnitude of what they'd initiated, but lacking the courage to break away from Connor's gravitational pull of malevolent charisma. The basement's fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across the scene, creating a tableau that would have belonged in a horror film if not for the very real terror in Emma's eyes as she watched her teacher at theatrical become another victim of Riverside's unwritten laws. But Connor Blake had made a critical error in his assessment of Jessica Martinez. The restraints that secured her to the radiator were tight enough to prevent escape through conventional means, but they hadn't eliminated her ability to move or shift her position relative to the massive iron structure that anchored her bonds. Years of training had taught her that leverage could overcome almost any disadvantage when applied with sufficient knowledge and determination. The radiator itself would become her weapon, its immovable bulk providing the foundation she needed to generate the kind of force that would transform her apparent defeat into devastating victory. Connor's celebration was about to become his nightmare, and the basement detention room was about to witness a demonstration of why underestimating your opponent was always a fatal mistake. The confidence radiating from Connor as he stepped back to admire his handiwork revealed just how completely he'd misunderstood the nature of his captive. Jessica's apparent submission to the restraints had lulled him into believing that physical control equated to psychological victory, a dangerous assumption that would soon prove catastrophically wrong. The zip ties bit into her wrists with mechanical precision, but her breathing remained steady and controlled, each exhale calculated to maintain optimal oxygen flow while her mind cataloged every detail of her tactical situation. Ashley circled like a vulture with her phone extended, narrating the scene for her digital audience with the breathless excitement of someone who believed she was documenting Connor's ultimate triumph. Her commentary revealed the depth of her investment in this moment, describing how the mighty teacher had been brought low by superior planning and determination. She zoomed in on Jessica's restrained hands, completely missing the subtle way fingers moved to test the give in the plastic bonds and assess the anchor points where they connected to the radiator's iron framework. Mason had positioned himself near Emma, his nervous energy finally finding an outlet in casual cruelty towards someone even more helpless than their primary target. His kicks weren't particularly hard, more psychological harassment than physical assault, but they demonstrated how completely the group dynamic had shifted toward escalating violence. The basement's isolation had stripped away whatever restraints normally governed their behavior, creating a space where their worst impulses could flourish without fear of interruption or consequence. Connor's monologue about respect and consequences took on an increasingly unhinged quality as he paced the small room like a predator savoring the moment before delivering a killing blow. His words revealed a worldview where power justified any action, where his family's influence had convinced him that normal rules simply didn't apply to someone of his status and connections. The detention room had become his private kingdom where he could exercise absolute authority over anyone unfortunate enough to find themselves in his domain. The radiator's warmth seeped through Jessica's clothing as she pressed her back against its iron surface, using the contact to gauge its structural integrity and connection points. Decades of thermal expansion and contraction had loosened some of the mounting bolts, while others remained firmly anchored to the concrete wall behind. The massive pipes that fed heated water through the system created additional leverage points, their thick iron construction capable of withstanding tremendous force without deformation or failure. Jessica's training had included extensive work on ground fighting and submissions, scenarios where opponents might attempt to pin or restrain her in disadvantageous positions. The key to escaping such situations lay not in brute force, but in understanding how to use existing structures and leverage points to amplify limited movement into devastating effectiveness. The radiator represented not just her prison, but potentially the most powerful weapon in the room if she could position herself correctly to utilize its immovable bulk. Connor's approach signaled his intention to escalate beyond mere intimidation into actual physical assault, his hands already reaching toward Jessica's restrained form with obvious malicious intent. His years of wrestling had given him confidence in his ability to control and manipulate opponents through superior strength and positioning, but his experience had been limited to consensual competition against opponents who followed established rules and accepted defeat gracefully. The shift in Jessica's demeanor was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who understood the visual cues of someone transitioning from defensive patience to offensive action. Her breathing pattern changed slightly, drawing deeper oxygen into muscles that had been coiled like springs, waiting for the optimal moment to release their stored energy. Years of competition had taught her to mask preparation behind apparent submission, allowing opponents to commit to attacks that would leave them vulnerable to counteraction. Connor's overconfidence proved to be his undoing as he leaned forward within range of Jessica's legs, apparently forgetting that restraining her arms had done nothing to limit the mobility of her lower body. The kick that caught him in the solar plexus was delivered with surgical precision, targeting the nerve cluster that would temporarily paralyze his diaphragm and leave him gasping for breath like a fish pulled from water. But this was merely the opening movement in a sequence that would transform her apparent helplessness into overwhelming tactical advantage. Using the radiator as a fulcrum, Jessica leveraged her body weight and the anchor point of her restraints to generate rotational force that no amount of plastic zip ties could withstand. The engineering principle was simple but devastatingly effective, applying torque to the weakest point in the restraint system until the plastic snapped with a sharp crack that echoed through the basement like a gunshot. Her hands were free, but more importantly, Connor was doubled over and gasping while his two accomplices stood frozen in shock at this impossible reversal of fortune. Ashley's phone captured every moment of what followed, though she was too stunned to maintain her previous commentary as events unfolded with a speed and violence that her social media experience had never prepared her to process. Mason's attempt to rush Jessica while she was still recovering from her escape proved to be perhaps the most poorly timed decision of his young life, charging directly into the path of someone whose muscle memory had been trained through thousands of hours of repetition to neutralize exactly this type of straightforward assault. The throw that sent Mason crashing into the concrete wall was a thing of beauty, a perfect demonstration of classical judo principles that used his own momentum and body weight to generate the force that left him crumpled unconscious beside a growing pool of blood from where his skull had impacted the unforgiving surface. The sound of the impact reverberated through the detention room like a thunderclap, finally penetrating Ashley's shock enough to make her realize that she was no longer documenting Connor's victory, but rather filming evidence of their complete and utter defeat. Connor's recovery from the initial kick was hampered by the psychological shock of watching his carefully planned domination scenario collapse into chaos within seconds. His wrestling training had never prepared him for combat against someone who possessed both superior technique and the kind of cold fury that came from years of channeling aggression into precise, devastating action. When he finally managed to straighten up and face Jessica directly, he found himself looking into eyes that held no trace of the fear or submission he'd expected to see. The second phase of their confrontation lasted even less time than the first, Connor's desperate tackle meeting a defensive technique that redirected his forward momentum into a spinning throw that sent him sailing through the air before crashing down onto the scattered remains of Emma's sketchbook, with enough force to drive the breath from his lungs and leave him seeing stars. But Jessica wasn't finished with him yet. Her systematic dismantling of his physical capabilities designed not just to neutralize the immediate threat, but to ensure he would never again feel confident about using violence to intimidate others. Ashley finally found her voice as Jessica approached Connor's prone form, screaming threats about her father's legal connections and the consequences that would rain down on anyone who dared to assault the children of Millfield's most prominent families. Her words revealed the same entitled worldview that had protected Connor for so long, the assumption that wealth and influence could shield them from the natural consequences of their actions, regardless of how egregious their behavior became. The zip ties that Connor had brought to restrain his victims proved remarkably effective when applied to their original owner, securing his hands behind his back with the same methodical precision he'd used on Emma and Jessica. His struggles were hampered by the pain radiating from multiple impact points where Jessica's defensive techniques had left their mark, each movement serving only to tighten the plastic bonds that now held him as securely as he'd intended to hold his captives. Emma's liberation from her restraints was accomplished with gentle efficiency, Jessica's calloused hands working carefully to restore circulation to wrists that bore the marks of Connor's casual cruelty. The contrast between the violence she'd just unleashed and the tender care with which she tended to Emma's injuries demonstrated the controlled nature of her response. Violence applied with surgical precision to neutralize threats while protecting innocent victims. The basement's fluorescent lighting flickered overhead as sirens began wailing in the distance, their approach signaling that the isolation, which had protected Connor's activities, was about to be shattered by the arrival of actual authority figures who operated outside his family's sphere of influence. Ashley's phone lay forgotten on the concrete floor, its screen cracked, but still recording the aftermath of what would soon become the most viral video in Millfield's history, for reasons completely opposite to what she'd originally intended. Connor Blake's reign of terror was over, ended not by administrative intervention or parental discipline, but by the simple application of superior skill and unwavering determination. The radiator that had served as the anchor for his planned domination now stood as a silent witness to his complete and humiliating defeat, its iron surface still warm with the heat that flowed through Riverside High's aging infrastructure. The sirens that had been distant wails moments before now screamed their urgent song directly outside Riverside High's main entrance, their red and blue strobes painting the November twilight in colors of emergency and consequence. Officer Patricia Williams was the first responder through the building's front doors, her 23 years of experience in Millfield's police department, having prepared her for domestic disputes and petty theft, but not for the scene that awaited her in the basement of the town's most prominent educational institution. The emergency call had come from Jessica's cell phone, a brief but urgent report of assault and false imprisonment that had triggered an immediate response from every available unit in the small town's modest police force. Williams had known the Martinez family peripherally through community events, aware that Jessica had moved to Millfield only recently, but carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to handling crisis situations with professional competence. The basement's maze of corridors and storage rooms initially confused the responding officers, their flashlights cutting through shadows that seemed to conceal decades of institutional secrets. The building's ancient infrastructure groaned and whispered around them as they followed Jessica's voice toward the detention room, where Connor Blake lay zip-tied and semi-conscious beside his equally restrained accomplice Ashley Reed, whose phone continued recording despite its cracked screen. Mason Torres remained unconscious against the concrete wall where Jessica's defensive throw had deposited him with enough force to require immediate medical attention. The blood pooling beneath his head created an abstract pattern on the floor that spoke to the serious nature of his injuries, though his steady breathing indicated that Jessica's techniques had been precisely calibrated to neutralize rather than cause permanent damage. Her years of training had included extensive instruction on controlling the level of force applied during defensive situations, ensuring that responses remained proportional to threats while still achieving tactical objectives. Emma Chen sat huddled in the corner where Jessica had moved her after cutting away the zip ties that had bound her to the radiator, her artistic hands still trembling from the circulation loss, but her eyes bright with a mixture of relief and something approaching hero worship. The scattered pages of her destroyed sketchbook lay around her like fallen leaves, each torn sheet representing hours of creative work that Connor's casual cruelty had transformed into debris in his quest for psychological dominance. Officer Williams's initial assessment of the crime scene revealed a complexity that would require careful documentation and extensive investigation to untangle. The physical evidence painted a clear picture of premeditated assault and false imprisonment, but the presence of a teacher among both the victims and those who had administered justice created procedural complications that would test every protocol in the department's manual. Williams had dealt with school violence before, but never a situation where an educator had been forced to defend herself and a student through techniques that left two suspects unconscious and requiring medical attention. The arrival of paramedics from Millfield General Hospital brought professional medical assessment to Mason's injuries, their evaluation confirming Jessica's calculated restraint in applying only enough force to neutralize immediate threats. The concussion was serious but not life-threatening, requiring overnight observation but not surgical intervention. His unconsciousness was temporary, a result of impact trauma that would heal completely with proper treatment and time. Ashley Reed's recovery of consciousness came with the gradual realization that her social media empire was about to collapse under the weight of evidence she had personally documented. Her phone's memory contained not just the assault on Emma and Jessica, but also weeks of previous bullying incidents that she had filmed for entertainment value, creating a digital archive of criminal behavior that would serve as prosecution evidence rather than viral content. The irony was lost on her initially. Her teenage mind, struggling to process how documenting cruelty for online fame had transformed into providing law enforcement with the tools needed to dismantle everything she valued. Connor Blake's awakening came more slowly, his body protesting movement, as multiple impact points reminded him of his spectacular defeat at the hands of someone he had dramatically underestimated. The zip ties securing his wrists behind his back were uncomfortably tight, and his ribs ached with each breath as he struggled to comprehend how his carefully planned demonstration of dominance had resulted in his complete humiliation and apparent arrest. Principal Davis arrived at the school within minutes of receiving Officer Williams's call, his normally composed demeanor cracking under the pressure of managing a crisis that threatened to expose years of willful blindness to Connor Blake's escalating behavior. His relationship with the Blake family had been built on a foundation of mutual benefit, their financial support ensuring his job security while his administrative protection allowed Connor to operate with virtual impunity within Riverside's walls. The principal's first instinct was damage control, an attempt to frame the evening's events as a misunderstanding between high-spirited teenagers and an overzealous substitute teacher who had responded with excessive force to a harmless prank. His carefully crafted narrative fell apart immediately when Officer Williams showed him Ashley's phone footage, the digital evidence revealing the premeditated nature of the assault and the clear self-defense circumstances that had justified Jessica's response. Michael Blake's arrival at the school came with the thunder of expensive tires on asphalt and the slam of a luxury sedan's door as Millfield's most influential citizen rushed to protect his son from consequences that had never touched the Blake family before. His relationship with Principal Davis had been cultivated over years of strategic donations and political pressure, creating a network of obligation and mutual benefit that had successfully insulated Connor from accountability throughout his academic career. The confrontation between Michael Blake and Officer Williams became the stuff of local legend, a clash between old money influence and professional law enforcement that revealed the fault lines running through Millfield's power structure. Blake's threats and demands for immediate release of his son met with Williams's calm recitation of criminal charges including assault, false imprisonment, and conspiracy, each count carrying penalties that no amount of political influence could simply wish away. The school board's emergency session convened at 8:30 that evening in the district's administrative building, a hastily called meeting that would reshape Riverside High's leadership structure and expose the systemic corruption that had allowed Connor Blake's behavior to escalate unchecked for years. Board members who had previously voted in lockstep with Michael Blake's wishes found themselves facing evidence that their enabling had directly contributed to criminal activity within their jurisdiction. Dr. Sarah Thompson, the district superintendent, had driven in from the county seat when initial reports suggested that the incident might require her direct intervention. Her 20-year career in educational administration had included experience with every form of crisis imaginable, but the combination of documented assault, false imprisonment, and staff involvement in physical confrontation represented unprecedented challenges to standard protocols and procedures. The investigation that followed would consume weeks of police time and reveal the extensive network of intimidation and fear that had allowed Connor Blake's behavior to flourish within Riverside's walls. Students who had previously been too terrified to speak out began coming forward with stories of harassment, theft, physical assault, and psychological torture that painted a picture of systematic abuse stretching back years. Emma Chen's courage in providing detailed testimony about her experiences became the catalyst for a broader reckoning with Riverside's toxic culture. Her artistic documentation of Connor's cruelty, sketches hidden in her personal notebooks that captured moments of humiliation and fear, provided visual evidence that supplemented the digital archive Ashley had unknowingly created through her social media activities. The viral nature of Ashley's footage transformed the Riverside incident into a national conversation about bullying, administrative accountability, and the failure of institutional authority to protect vulnerable students. News outlets across the country picked up the story, their coverage focusing on Jessica's background as a former competitive athlete who had been forced to defend herself and a student when school administrators failed to provide adequate protection. Jessica's past as Lena Vulov, Olympic judo hopeful whose career had ended in tragedy, became public knowledge through investigative reporting that traced her journey from international competition to a substitute teaching position in small-town Pennsylvania. The car accident that had claimed her brother Alex and ended her athletic dreams provided context for her transition into education, revealing a person seeking redemption through service to others. The revelation of Jessica's true identity brought unwanted media attention to Millfield, transforming the quiet industrial town into a focal point for discussions about institutional failure and individual heroism. Reporters camped outside the school and her modest apartment, seeking interviews and behind-the-scenes access to a story that had captured national imagination through its combination of sport, education, and justice themes. Connor Blake's criminal charges proceeded through the legal system with methodical precision, his father's political influence proving insufficient to overcome the weight of video evidence and eyewitness testimony. The false imprisonment charges alone carried potential felony convictions that would follow him through college applications and employment searches for years to come, while the assault charges added additional complications to his legal situation. Ashley Reed's cooperation with prosecutors became essential to building cases against Connor and Mason, her extensive digital archive providing evidence of systematic harassment that extended far beyond the basement incident. Her plea agreement required complete disclosure of all bullying activities she had documented, transforming her phone's memory into a comprehensive record of institutional failure and criminal behavior. Mason Torres's medical recovery proceeded slowly, his concussion requiring extended treatment that kept him hospitalized for several days, while his family grappled with legal bills and the social stigma of their son's involvement in assault charges. His football scholarship prospects evaporated as college recruiters withdrew interest, unwilling to associate their programs with documented criminal behavior. The school board's response to the crisis involved wholesale changes to Riverside's administrative structure, beginning with Principal Davis's immediate resignation and continuing through policy reforms designed to prevent future incidents of systematic harassment. Michael Blake's resignation from the board came under pressure from other members, who recognized that his continued presence would damage the district's credibility and legal position. Dr. Thompson's investigation into Riverside's culture revealed systemic problems that extended beyond Connor Blake's individual behavior. uncovering a pattern of administrative negligence that had allowed harassment to flourish while punishing students who attempted to report incidents through official channels. Her recommendations included comprehensive staff retraining, policy updates, and structural changes designed to prevent future institutional failures. Jessica's decision to remain at Riverside, despite the media attention and ongoing legal proceedings, demonstrated her commitment to the educational mission that had brought her to Millfield initially. Her temporary position became permanent when the district recognized that losing someone of her caliber would send the wrong message about their commitment to creating safe learning environments for all students. The self-defense program that Jessica developed for Riverside students became a model for other districts dealing with bullying and harassment issues, her approach emphasizing confidence building and situational awareness rather than aggressive confrontation. Her Olympic-level training provided credibility that attracted students who might otherwise have been reluctant to participate in traditional physical education activities. Emma Chen's transformation from victim to advocate became one of the most powerful outcomes of the entire incident, her quiet courage inspiring other students to speak out about their experiences, while her artistic talents found new expression in anti-bullying campaigns and peer support initiatives. Her Phoenix drawings became symbols of resilience and renewal throughout the district, inspiring merchandise and fundraising efforts that supported victims of harassment. The peer support group that Emma established with Jessica's guidance grew from a handful of Connor's former victims into a comprehensive network that provided emotional support, advocacy assistance, and educational resources for students dealing with harassment and intimidation. Their meetings became safe spaces where young people could share experiences and develop strategies for handling difficult situations. The transformation of Riverside's culture required months of sustained effort from students, staff, and community members who recognized that real change demanded more than policy updates and administrative reshuffling. Jessica's presence provided steady leadership during the transition period, her reputation for protective action encouraging students to trust that reports of harassment would be taken seriously and addressed promptly. The criminal trials that followed provided public forums for discussing the broader implications of institutional failure and individual accountability in educational settings. Connor Blake's conviction on multiple felony charges sent clear messages about the consequences of using violence and intimidation to control others, while Ashley Reed's cooperation demonstrated the potential for rehabilitation and redemption through honest acknowledgement of harmful behavior. Michael Blake's business empire suffered significant damage from the negative publicity surrounding his son's crimes, and his own role in enabling systematic harassment through political pressure and financial manipulation. Several major contracts were canceled by clients who wished to distance themselves from association with documented institutional corruption, forcing him to reassess his approach to community involvement and influence peddling. The media coverage eventually shifted focus from the sensational aspects of the basement confrontation to the deeper issues of educational reform and systemic change that the incident had highlighted. Jessica's measured responses to interview requests emphasized her commitment to students and education rather than personal recognition or celebrity status, keeping attention focused on institutional improvements rather than individual heroism. The anniversary of the basement incident became an annual occasion for reflecting on progress made and challenges remaining in creating genuinely safe educational environments. Emma's Phoenix symbol was incorporated into Riverside's official anti-bullying materials, serving as a permanent reminder that transformation and renewal were possible even in the aftermath of serious trauma and institutional failure. Jessica's evolution from substitute teacher to permanent faculty member and student advocate demonstrated how crisis situations could reveal character and purpose in unexpected ways. Her Olympic training had prepared her physically for the basement confrontation, but her commitment to education and student welfare provided the moral foundation that sustained her through the difficult months of legal proceedings and media attention. The ripple effects of that November evening continued spreading through Millfield's community for years afterward, influencing everything from school board elections to business practices as residents grappled with questions about power, accountability, and collective responsibility for protecting vulnerable community members. The lesson that institutional failure could have serious personal consequences resonated far beyond Riverside's walls. Connor Blake's incarceration provided him with opportunities for reflection and potential rehabilitation that his previous life of privilege and impunity had never required. The structured environment and mandatory counseling sessions forced him to confront the psychological patterns that had led to his predatory behavior, though his willingness to engage with these opportunities remained an open question throughout his sentence. Ashley Reed's community service obligations included speaking to student groups about the dangers of documenting and participating in harassment activities, her first-hand experience with consequences, providing powerful testimony about how quickly destructive behavior could escalate beyond control. Her presentations emphasized personal responsibility and the importance of intervention when witnessing harmful activities. The legal precedents established through the Riverside prosecutions influenced how similar cases were handled in other jurisdictions, particularly regarding the responsibilities of educational institutions to protect students from peer harassment and the circumstances under which defensive force could be justified in school settings. Law enforcement agencies throughout the region updated their training protocols based on lessons learned from the investigation. The professional development programs that emerged from Dr. Thompson's reforms included extensive training on recognizing and responding to harassment patterns, with particular emphasis on identifying the warning signs that institutional cultures might be enabling rather than preventing harmful behavior. Jessica's expertise became a valuable resource for these training initiatives. The scholarship fund established in Emma's name provided financial assistance for students whose educational opportunities had been damaged by harassment and intimidation, recognizing that the effects of systematic bullying often extended far beyond immediate physical or emotional harm. The fund's success demonstrated community commitment to supporting recovery and resilience among young people. The documentary film that eventually chronicled the Riverside incident focused on systemic issues rather than individual heroics, using Jessica's story as a lens for examining broader questions about institutional accountability, community responsibility, and the power of individual action to catalyze meaningful change. Its educational value led to widespread use in professional development and training programs. Jessica's marriage to David Chen, Emma's older brother who had returned from military service to support his sister through the aftermath of her trauma, represented the kind of unexpected connection that emerged from shared experiences of crisis and recovery. Their relationship developed slowly through mutual respect and common commitment to protecting vulnerable community members from institutional failures. The expansion of Riverside's arts program, inspired by Emma's use of creative expression to process trauma and advocate for change, provided students with additional outlets for dealing with difficult experiences while developing skills that could serve them throughout their lives. Jessica's support for these initiatives demonstrated her understanding that healing required multiple approaches and sustained commitment. The annual Emma Chen Phoenix Awards recognize students, staff, and community members who demonstrated exceptional courage in standing up to harassment and supporting peers through difficult situations. This ceremony became a highlight of Riverside's academic year, celebrating the values of resilience, integrity, and mutual support that had emerged from the basement incident. The research studies that followed examined the effectiveness of various intervention strategies in preventing and responding to harassment situations, with Riverside serving as a case study in comprehensive institutional reform. Jessica's role in these studies provided academic credibility while ensuring that practical classroom experience informed theoretical recommendations. The regional training center that eventually developed from these research efforts became a resource for schools throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states, offering evidence-based programs for preventing harassment and responding effectively when incidents occurred. Jessica's position as director allowed her to influence educational policy at levels far beyond individual classroom instruction. Emma's acceptance to the prestigious Savannah College of Art and Design came with a full scholarship that recognized both her artistic talents and her advocacy work, providing opportunities to continue developing her creative skills while studying approaches to using art for social change and community healing. Her phoenix symbol became the logo for the college's anti-bullying initiative. The book that Jessica eventually wrote about her experiences at Riverside became required reading in many educational administration programs. Its practical insights into institutional reform and crisis management, providing valuable guidance for principals and superintendents dealing with similar challenges. The royalties supported continued expansion of anti-harassment programs throughout the region. Connor Blake's early release from prison came with strict probation conditions that included continued counseling, community service, and regular reporting requirements designed to monitor his progress toward genuine rehabilitation. His case became a study in the potential for meaningful change among individuals who had previously shown little capacity for empathy or personal growth. The community garden that was established on the site of the old detention room represented physical transformation of a space associated with trauma and abuse into something that generated beauty and nourishment for local residents. Jessica's involvement in the project demonstrated her commitment to creating positive alternatives to spaces that had previously harbored negative activities. The increase in applications for teaching positions at Riverside following the reforms reflected improved reputation and working conditions that attracted high-quality educators committed to student welfare and academic excellence. Jessica's mentorship of new teachers ensured that institutional memory included lessons learned from the basement incident and ongoing commitment to protective intervention. The counseling services that became available to all Riverside students provided professional support for those dealing with trauma, harassment, or other challenges that might interfere with their educational progress. Jessica's advocacy for these services reflected her understanding that academic success required attention to students' emotional and psychological welfare, as well as intellectual development. The partnership between Riverside and local law enforcement agencies created new protocols for responding to harassment incidents, ensuring that serious situations received appropriate investigation and intervention while maintaining educational environments that supported learning and growth. Officer Williams's continued involvement provided valuable liaison between school and police perspectives. The graduation ceremony, where Emma delivered the valedictory address, included references to the phoenix symbol that had become central to Riverside's identity, her speech emphasizing themes of resilience, transformation, and community responsibility that resonated with audience members who had witnessed the school's evolution over the preceding years. Jessica's recognition as Pennsylvania Teacher of the Year reflected not just her individual achievements, but also the broader transformation that Riverside had undergone through collective commitment to creating genuinely safe and supportive learning environments for all students. Her acceptance speech emphasized the collaborative nature of meaningful institutional change. The endowment that Michael Blake established to support anti-bullying programs represented his attempt at redemption following his son's conviction, and his own recognition of complicity in enabling systematic harassment through political pressure and financial manipulation. His contributions supported research and program development at institutions throughout the region. The peer mediation programs that expanded throughout the district provided students with tools for resolving conflicts before they escalated to harassment or violence, with training that emphasized communication skills, empathy development, and collaborative problem-solving approaches. Jessica's involvement ensured that these programs reflected practical experience with crisis intervention. The reunion gathering that took place 5 years after the basement incident brought together students, staff, and community members to celebrate progress made and renew commitments to continued improvement. Emma's presentation of a new phoenix sculpture to the school served as permanent reminder of the possibility for positive transformation even in the aftermath of serious trauma. The national conference presentations that Jessica delivered shared Riverside's experience with educators and administrators from across the country, providing practical guidance based on documented success in creating comprehensive institutional change. Her expertise became a valuable resource for communities dealing with similar challenges. The documentary's sequel, released 10 years after the original incident, examined long-term outcomes and lessons learned through sustained commitment to institutional reform and community healing. Its focus on systemic change rather than individual heroics provided valuable perspective on the complex processes required for meaningful transformation. The legacy scholarship that Connor Blake established upon completing his sentence and rehabilitation programs provided educational opportunities for students who had overcome adversity and demonstrated commitment to positive community involvement. His personal transformation represented possibility for genuine change among individuals who had previously caused significant harm to others. The mental health awareness programs that became integrated into Riverside's curriculum addressed the psychological factors that could contribute to aggressive behavior, while providing all students with tools for managing stress, processing difficult emotions, and seeking appropriate support when needed. Jessica's advocacy ensured that these programs remained practical and accessible. The community response team that developed from lessons learned during the crisis provided coordinated support for families dealing with harassment, trauma, or other challenges that affected student welfare and academic progress. The team's effectiveness demonstrated value of comprehensive approaches that addressed multiple aspects of complex social problems. The research publication that documented Riverside's transformation became influential in educational policy discussions, its evidence-based recommendations supporting arguments for increased investment in harassment prevention and institutional reform initiatives. Jessica's co-authorship provided credibility from practical implementation experience. The professional consulting work that Jessica undertook during summer breaks allowed her to share expertise with other districts while maintaining her primary commitment to Riverside students and continued program development. Her reputation attracted requests from school systems throughout the region and eventually from national organizations. The wedding ceremony held in Riverside's gymnasium 5 years after the basement incident celebrated not just Jessica and David's marriage, but also the transformation of a space that had once witnessed fear and violence into a place of joy and community celebration. Emma's role as maid of honor symbolized the family bonds that had developed through shared experiences of trauma and recovery. The annual conference that eventually grew from local training initiatives became a major regional event attracting educators, administrators, law enforcement personnel, and community leaders committed to creating safe learning environments. Jessica's keynote addresses provided inspiration while practical workshops offered concrete tools for implementation. The retirement ceremony that honored Officer Williams 25 years after the basement incident included recognition of her role in ensuring that the investigation was conducted with professional integrity despite political pressure from influential community members. Her commitment to justice had provided foundation for all subsequent reforms and improvements. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.